Legacy Explorers is a channel that explores significant historical events and shares our discoveries with you. Join us on our journey of discovery. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.
The French Revolution was a time of radical change in France that shook the foundations of the old regime and ushered in a new era of liberty, equality, and fraternity. But how did it all begin? And what were the main events and characters that shaped this epic saga of blood, fire, and glory? Let's find out in this video. The story begins in the late 18th century when France was ruled by an absolute monarchy led by King Louis XV and his wife, Marie Antoinette. The king and the nobility enjoyed lavish lifestyles and privileges, while the majority of the people, known as the Third Estate, suffered from poverty, hunger, and oppression. The Third Estate consisted of the bourgeoisie, the middle class, the peasants, and the urban workers. They had no political representation and paid most of the taxes, while the clergy and the nobility, who made up the First and Second Estates, were exempt from many of them. The situation worsened when France got involved in the American War of Independence, which drained its finances and increased its debt. To solve the crisis, the king appointed a series of ministers who tried to reform the tax system and reduce the spending, but they faced strong opposition from the privileged classes, who refused to give up their benefits. The king also faced resistance from the parliament, the courts of justice that had the power to veto his edicts. In 1788, after a series of bad harvests and food shortages, the king decided to summon the Estates General, a national assembly of representatives from the three estates, for the first time since 1614. The Estates General was supposed to approve a new tax plan, but it soon became a battleground for the different factions. The Third Estate demanded more power and equality, while the First and Second Estates tried to preserve the status quo. The Third Estate also wanted to vote by head, meaning that each individual would have one vote, instead of by order, meaning that each estate would have one vote. So this would give them a majority over the other two estates, who had fewer members. On May 5, 1789, the Estates General opened in Versailles, the royal palace near Paris. The Third Estate soon realized that the king and the nobility were not willing to compromise and decided to take matters into their own hands. On June 17, they declared themselves the National Assembly, the only legitimate representative of the nation. 3 days later, they found their meeting hall locked and guarded by soldiers and suspected that the king was plotting to dissolve them. They then moved to a nearby indoor tennis court, where they took a solemn oath not to separate until they had written a constitution for France. This was known as the Tennis Court Oath, and it marked the first step of the revolution. The king, however, was not ready to give up his authority. He ordered the other two estates to join the National Assembly, but he also gathered troops around Paris and Versailles, preparing for a possible confrontation. The people of Paris, who were already angry and restless, feared that the king was going to attack the National Assembly and crush their hopes for reform. They also heard rumors that the king was planning to starve them by cutting off the food supply. On July 14, 1789, a mob of Parisians stormed the Bastille, a medieval fortress and prison that symbolized the tyranny and oppression of the monarchy. They killed the governor and the guards and freed the prisoners, who were only 7 at the time. They also seized the weapons and ammunition stored there. The fall of the Bastille was a turning point in the revolution, as it showed the power and courage of the people and inspired them to rise up against the old regime. The revolution spread throughout the country as peasants and workers rebelled against their feudal lords and employers and demanded their rights and freedoms. They burned down castles and manors and destroyed the records of their debts and obligations. They also formed militias and national guards to protect themselves and their communities. This was known as the Great Fear, as it terrified the nobility and the clergy who fled the country or joined the revolution. The National Assembly, meanwhile, continued to work on the Constitution and also passed a series of laws that abolished the privileges and feudal rights of the nobility and the clergy, and declared that all men were equal and free. On August 26, 1789, they issued the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen, a document that proclaimed the universal and natural rights of all human beings, such as liberty, property, security, and resistance to oppression. The Declaration also stated that the sovereignty belonged to the people and that the government was accountable to them. The king, however, was still reluctant to accept the changes and tried to escape from France with his family in June 1791. He was caught and brought back to Paris, where he was forced to swear allegiance to the constitution, which limited his powers and made France a constitutional monarchy. The people, however, lost their trust and respect for him, and some of them wanted to get rid of him altogether. The revolution also faced opposition from abroad, as the other European monarchies feared that the revolutionary ideas would spread to their countries and threaten their thrones. They formed a coalition and declared war on France in 1792, hoping to restore the old regime and the king's authority. The war, however, only intensified the revolutionary fervor and gave rise to a new political faction, the Jacobins, who advocated for a more radical and democratic republic. They were led by Maximilien Robespierre, a lawyer and politician who became the most influential and controversial figure of the revolution. The Jacobins gained control of the National Convention, the new legislative body that replaced the National Assembly, and abolished the monarchy on September 21, 1792. They also put the king on trial for treason and sentenced him to death by guillotine on January 21, 1793. His wife, Marie Antoinette, met the same fate 9 months later. The execution of the king and queen shocked the world and provoked more hostility from the foreign enemies, as well as from the internal opponents who were either loyal to the monarchy or dissatisfied with the Jacobins' policies. The country was divided and threatened by civil war as different regions and groups rebelled against the central government. The Jacobins responded with a campaign of terror in which they arrested, tried and executed anyone who was suspected of being an enemy of the revolution. They also introduced a new calendar, a new religion, and a new system of weights and measures in an attempt to create a new and rational society. The Reign of Terror lasted from September 1793 to July 1794 and claimed the lives of about 40,000 people, many of whom were innocent or moderate. It also turned the people against the Jacobins, who became increasingly paranoid and violent. Yet Robespierre, who had become the leader of the Committee of Public Safety, the de facto executive power, was accused of tyranny and dictatorship and was overthrown and executed by his former allies on July 28, 1794. This ended the Reign of Terror and ushered in a more moderate and conservative phase of the revolution, known as the Thermidorian Reaction. The Thermidorians established a new constitution and a new government called the Directory, which consisted of 5 directors and 2 chambers of deputies. The Directory ruled France from 1795 to 1799 and tried to stabilize the country and the economy while continuing the war against the foreign enemies. However, the Directory was also corrupt and inefficient and faced opposition from both the Royalists and the Radicals, who wanted to restore the monarchy or the Republic, respectively. The Directory also relied on the army to maintain its authority, and this gave rise to a new and ambitious leader who would change the course of the revolution and the history of France, Napoleon Bonaparte. Napoleon was a young and talented general who had distinguished himself in the wars against the Austrians and the British, and had conquered Italy and Egypt. He was popular and respected among the soldiers and the people, and he had a vision of glory and empire. He also had a coup d'état, a sudden and illegal seizure of power, which he carried out on November 9, 1799, with the help of his allies and supporters. He overthrew the Directory and established a new constitution and a new government called the Consulate, in which he was the first consul and had almost absolute power. He later crowned himself as the Emperor of the French and embarked on a series of wars and conquests that made him the master of most of Europe. He also reformed the laws, the administration, the education, and the culture of France, and left a lasting legacy that still influences the world today. The French Revolution, however, was not over yet. It had unleashed a wave of revolutionary movements and nationalist sentiments across Europe and beyond, and had inspired many people to fight for their rights and freedoms. It had also created many enemies and rivals who opposed Napoleon's domination and ambition, and who eventually formed a coalition and defeated him at the Battle of Waterloo in 1815. Napoleon was exiled and died in 1821, and the monarchy was restored in France. But the revolution had changed the world forever. The French Revolution was one of the most important and influential events in world history. It was a time of courage and sacrifice, of hope and despair, of violence and terror, of reform and innovation, of glory and tragedy. It was a time when the people rose up against the old order and created a new one, based on the ideals of liberty, equality, and fraternity. It was a time when the modern world was born.
Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.